this on? Can you all hear me? All right. Well, good evening. Good to see you all. It's really good to see you because I thought weather may have prevented this evening from occurring. Before I share about Henry Dumas, I do need to thank everyone here for coming out and for being a part of this. And as Paula, Dr. Connolly, indicated, I'm here, but I'm not the only one who's done the work to get me here, right? So my family, the one I created, and my wife and my kids, and the one I was born into on Beatties Ford Road, thank you for all that you all do for me, and you continue to show me, give me love and support. And beyond my family and my neighborhood and my church, and I got some fellow deacons here tonight, I'm truly, I've benefited from everyone investing in me. And I think we need to remember that as we, as a community, try to do better by our children, right? So beyond family, church, community, my colleagues in the English department, and my department chair, and I've made him my official publicist, Dr. Mark West, because he sends out everything about me to folks, and it's all good. So keep it up, Mark. But he and my colleagues in the English department and in the college, led by our dean, Nancy Gutierrez, have always been supportive and given me a number of opportunities. And speaking of which, I also want to acknowledge our provost, who has made numerous efforts in supporting me in my endeavors this year as faculty president. But after this year, we'll have another one. So I'm just letting you know. So having said that, I'll go ahead and share with you my presentation for the evening. Let's see if I can wake this up. Okay. See if this will do it. Yeah, just had to get revived. All right. Henry Dumas and the Briar Patch of Black Biography. And as I move through, I think you'll understand what I mean by Briar Patch. All right. The story of Henry Dumas actually starts with another writer, Toni Morrison. I'll speak more about her later, but Morrison was one of the key figures who led the publishing effort to introduce Henry Dumas to the world. The most frequent question I've encountered about writing the biography is one Morrison certainly heard, and it went along these lines. What's significant about Dumas? After all, he was unknown, his writings were published after his death, and he hadn't even published a novel. Morrison replied with this, and I quote, Henry Dumas had completed work, the quality and quantity of which are almost never achieved in several lifetimes. Morrison's assertion intrigued me. It pushed me to ask this question. If Dumas was as good as she proclaimed, why was there relatively little information about him? Where was the story behind his stories and the novel that would be published after his death? For the next few minutes, I'll share with you my answer to these and other questions. Some of you may not be familiar with Henry Dumas, so before we enter the biographical Briar Patch, I'd like to share with you the standard narrative, excuse me, that you would have found before the publication of my book if you had done an internet search on Dumas. You just Google Henry Dumas, and this is the information that you would have gotten. He was born in 1934 in a sleepy small town outside of Little Rock, Arkansas, called Sweet Home, right? He lived there with family till about age 10, and then he decided to move to Harlem with extended family, and he went there, did well, graduated from high school in 1953 from Commerce High School. And right after high school, he would go to the Air Force, right? And maybe a couple of months after he had signed on the dotted line to go to the Air Force, he met a girl. He still went to the Air Force, but he kept in touch with that girl, and her name was Loretta Ponton, and she would become his wife. He spent 3 years in the Air Force, and included in that was a stint in Saudi Arabia, so he was introduced close up to Islam. He didn't become a Muslim, but he developed an appreciation for the Islamic faith. After the Air Force, he after the Air Force, he moved to New Jersey with his wife. He began college at Rutgers University in 1958. They also had their first child in 1958. And basically, from 1958 to 1965, he was in school, here and there, all right? He had a family of his wife, and he had 2 sons. They had 2 sons. And so he work a semester, he attend school a semester, take off a semester, you know, just family and other interests presented a challenge for him in terms of finishing his degree. And so he wouldn't finish his degree at Rutgers, where he was studying, at least according to his transcript, American civilization, right? So from 58 to 65, that's what he's doing, right? And that's in New Jersey, New York area, right? Well, by 1968, he's relocated to East St. Louis, Illinois, right? And again, in the biographical sketches, that's all it says. He relocated to Illinois. He worked in what was called an anti-poverty education program called the Experiment in Higher Education, which was basically a program to bring non-traditional students into the college and university setting, right? He's doing that in 67, 68. And in 1968, May of 1968, he goes to New York for a wedding. And he has an altercation with a New York City transit cop. And he's shot. He's killed, right? This is a couple of weeks, about 7 weeks, 8 weeks after the assassination of Dr. King, right? So I'm not saying that it would have been national news had Dr. King not been assassinated, that everybody would have known about Dumas, but given what had happened with King and the fact that across the country there was urban unrest, his story sort of got lost, right? And so that's basically what you would have heard or what you would have read if you had Googled him before the publication of my book. So having said that, I'm going to share now with you how that impacted me, how that information that I looked at prompted me to ask a couple of questions, right? So I worded in this way. And thus begins the briar patch that inaugurates Henry Dumas's literary life. In the 1970s, with black arts and black power flourishing, black writers, especially women, were experiencing a mini renaissance in the publishing world. Meanwhile, now remember, this is the 70s, Dumas was killed in 1968. Meanwhile, black arts poet Eugene B. Redmond and a few others were working to produce Henry Dumas's first volumes of fiction and poetry through a university press. So he dies in 68, early 70s, there's an effort to publish his work. As a result, a senior editor at Random House named Toni Morrison, upon learning of Dumas, she sees a copy of a collection of short stories published by the university press, and upon learning of him through these stories, she committed herself to publishing his work in trade editions. But for Morrison, despite her belief in the vibrancy of his work and the somewhat romantic musing by others about what his literary life would have been, her main problem was publishing the work of an unknown and deceased black writer. How do you make that pitch to Random House, right? You're a senior editor, yes, right? But you got a couple of strikes against you from the start, right? Hardly any of his work had been published. He's unknown, he's deceased, right? All you have is what he had written, right? The Random House trade editions of Dumas's work introduced him to new generations of readers. So Morrison was successful in getting them published. She termed the growing cult, or she referred to the growing interest in Henry Dumas as the cult of Henry Dumas. And she acknowledged devotees like Eugene B. Redmond, who had been a friend of his in East St. Louis. As his literary executor, as Dumas's literary executor, Redmond argued that Dumas was one of the most gifted writers of his generation. And here is where I enter the picture, if you will. I was marginally familiar with the Dumas name, not his work especially. As I read more of his work, I found echoes of Langston Hughes and Ralph Ellison, poetic riffs on the meaning of blackness, narrative explorations of race and citizenship that defied narrow characterization, and a love of Southern black language. He colored the South in all of its brilliance and ugliness, the North in all of its action, opportunity, and oppression. In his poetry, Africa is on his tongue. In his fiction, characters see and hear in different ways. But there were relatively, as I read up on him and read his work, there are relatively few essays about him that considered his body of posthumously published work and the questions that emerged in my mind about his life. What impact did moving to New York have on him, for example? What about his experience at Rutgers in the late 50s and 60s? When he was at Rutgers, he interacted with people like Robert Pinsky, who's a former poet laureate, Jay Wright, a major poet who's still living today. What was the impact of his interactions with folks like that, and Ralph Ellison, whom I'll talk about in a few minutes? If he was in the New York area with most of the major publishers in the mid-60s, 1965, 66, what took him out to Illinois? You're in the hot spot, right? So what pushed him to go out to Illinois? Such were the questions left for the biographer. But was there enough material, I had to ask myself, for such a relatively short literary life? He's killed in 68, right before his 34th birthday. So as talented as he may have been, did I have enough to do what I wanted to do? Did I have enough to write a book? Right. Put another way, what was the story behind the common biographical information available on the internet and in anthologies? I wanted more, right? And everywhere I went, it simply it wasn't there. That information did not exist. So, as you can tell, this is a photograph from his wedding, which occurred in 1955, and this was at Loretta Ponton's house, or now Loretta Dumas. And an interesting side note about this, they married in 1955. This was around the time Emmett Till was murdered, right? And from the time of that tragedy, horrible tragedy, Loretta Dumas said that even then he changed and was never the same compared to the man she met just a couple of years before in 1953, right? So this is their wedding photo, right? But back to where I am in trying to write the book. I contacted her, right, and Eugene B. Redmond, his literary executor, and expressed my interest in writing the book. It would take a year or so for them to develop a level of trust with me because others had approached them about telling the Dumas story. But once they did say yes or develop a level of trust for me, I soon realized the briar patch that lay before me. Loretta Dumas and Eugene B. Redmond granted me unlimited and unconditional access to the Dumas archive of manuscripts and college papers, but with this caveat. Redmond had known Dumas only during his last year in East St. Louis, so that would have been academic year 67, 68, right? So his personal knowledge of his dear friend was chronologically limited. And Loretta Dumas, though a faithful and attentive wife, had really not known that her husband had created a different life outside their home during their time in New Jersey when he was at Rutgers, right? Now this is what she's telling me, right, when I'm visiting her. And to add to the quagmire, if you will, not quagmire, that's a little strong. To add to the complexity, from 1963 to 1967, this other life that Mrs. Dumas told me about, that Henry had, right? This other life, or shall we say, this other woman, was Jewish and 9 years his junior. Loretta Dumas tells me that if I want to know certain aspects of Dumas's life, especially those involving his presence on the literary scene at Rutgers, I will have to seek this woman out. Loretta Dumas did not know what Lois Wright had in her possession, but she knew that Lois Wright had knowledge that no one else had. I must add here that Loretta Dumas, who's still living, she's fine, that in her I have not come across a more graceful and gracious person for being willing to share her information with me and to set me out on this path, right? I think you all can appreciate, right. Yeah, just psychologically, sociologically speaking, this is, I didn't know this is what I was getting into. So this is part of when you're writing someone's story, you just never know where you may go, right? So there I was, staring into what was surely a briar patch of tangled emotions: race, religion, complex friendships, marriage, infidelity. One more element to the story. Lois Wright married one of Henry Dumas's closest friends from the early 1960s. His name was Jay Wright, the poet Jay Wright, right? So Jay and Henry used to party, explore life in interesting ways. And a couple of years after he's killed, she married him. And they've been married for over 40 years, right? So he's the critically acclaimed poet, right? For me, in order to make this biography fly, I needed to convince Loretta Dumas that I could reveal Henry in all of his imperfect humanity. She didn't want some of the decisions that he had made in his life to overshadow his literary significance. And I had to convince Lois Wright, or assure her, that I was not engaging in a subjective celebration of this mythical figure. She just thought I wanted to praise Henry Dumas and not point out some of the perhaps less appealing aspects of his person, right? Regarding Jay Wright, his best friend, or one of his good friends, he agreed to discuss anything with me off the record. You feel me? Good. As he would not consent to a formal interview. Herein lies the beauty and challenge of having living sources. Without them, this book would not have been written. With them, I had to be mindful of the sensitive nature of what was a disconcerting scenario for all involved. In Dumas's wife and former companion, and two of his closest male confidants, I learned the depth of their emotional investment in this talented mercurial writer from a place called Sweet Home. To this point, I've shared some of the details and challenges of writing the Dumas biography. I'll now share an excerpt from one of his stories to provide you with some sense of his fictional palette. You've heard me talk about him. I think it'd be good for you to hear him. Ark of Bones, published posthumously in 1970 in the volume of the same title, is a prototype for black fiction in the post-civil rights era. It features a soul boat that journeys down the Mississippi collecting the bones of African ancestors. And those of you who are familiar with Toni Morrison, I know some of my students, they respect and admire Morrison, but sometimes they think that her fiction is too hard to engage, right? But a term that's often associated with her is magical realism, right? Where things occur that defy our understanding of logic, right? And in this story, Ark of Bones, with this ark sailing down the Mississippi, recovering the bones of African ancestors, it's sort of in that vein. In fact, some would argue that some of what Morrison does in her fiction is influenced by Dumas, right? And just another nugget, the plantation in Beloved is called Sweet Home. Henry's from Sweet Home, Arkansas. Morrison said there's not a connection, but even if it's not, it looks good, it sounds good, right? He's from Sweet Home, plantation in Beloved is called Sweet Home, right? So this is the story. It features a soul boat that journeys down the Mississippi, collecting the bones of African ancestors. Two adolescents rising into manhood, named Head-Eye and Fish-Hound, are the main characters. Head-Eye can see what many others can't. And he introduces the narrator, Fish-Hound, to this spirit world. They become part of this blackened version of the biblical flood story. In this tale, humans and animals are not saved from the flood, but human bones are recovered from the iconic river that ushered blacks into both slavery and freedom. And what I mean by that, if you read Huck Finn, right, there are times when Jim is in free territory, there are other times when he's not, right? Fish-Hound is talking here, and he says, bones, I saw bones. I looked, and I saw crews of black men handling in them bones, end quote. As metaphor, this story, in haunting narrative vision, delineates the cost of the Middle Passage. The black sacrifice for America has cut to the bone. Fish-Hound continues observing this ritual. As these sacred bones are recovered, a man sings in a strange yet familiar language. That much Fish-Hound can figure out, but he says he was never good at foreign talk. He remembers the sounds, but cannot translate these utterances. I'll give you a sample of what the utterances are, okay? Abba, Abba, Alhamdulillah, Abba, Abba, Mutu, brother, Abba, Abba, Alhamdulillah, Abba, Abba, brother, brother, Abba, Abba, Dajuka, brother, Abba, Abba, Alhamdulillah. In this moment, where past and present are conflated, Dumas explores the challenge for blacks in America of learning about their African past and returning to their first, as in original, languages. It's not clear what these lines mean. Abba, depending on context, is associated with camel's hair. Alhamdulillah is Arabic, meaning praise God. Dajuka refers to black people of Dutch Guyana. These two southern black youths do not know their place of origin, Fish-Hound and Head-Eye, the original language of their ancestors. The foreign talk that Fish-Hound hears is Dumas's way of pointing out how the history, language, and cultural traditions of the that the history, language, and cultural traditions were taken away by the Middle Passage, in many cases dismantled or destroyed, right? This story, or shall we say this tale of the Ark, was most likely composed sometime after 1965. Excuse me. I'm looking for a particular, okay, all right. As I said, this story was composed most likely sometime after 1965, the year Dumas met the legendary jazz pianist Sun Ra. Originally based out of Chicago, Sun Ra was one of the most experimental and certainly one of the most gifted performers of the period. He created his own intergalactic orchestra, and you can Google Sun Ra. There's a lot of information about him, and there's a biography about him. So he created the Intergalactic Orchestra, and his band's experimentation with sound, mood, and the musical sensibility was legendary in hardcore jazz circles. He was born in the cosmos, he would say, really Birmingham, Alabama, right? And he imparted this cosmic imaginative vision to Dumas as often as he could between the time they met in 1965 to the day of Henry's death in 1968. Sun Ra was one of the last people to see Dumas before that ill-fated moment on the subway platform. In at least 3 of Dumas's stories and some of his poems as well, the Sun Ra imprint is overt. Dumas tried to parlay Sun Ra's creativity as a musician onto the page, and in some cases, he was most successful. Indeed, Ark of Bones is one of Dumas's signature stories. But Dumas, in a decade where the black male writer seemed especially in vogue, and what I mean by that is, in the 1960s, black men had published a good bit. As I said earlier, 1970s, black women would have somewhat of a mini renaissance. Probably the last third of the 20th century, you have 3 black women writers who are really at the top of the publishing world. They would be Alice Walker, Toni Morrison, and Gloria Naylor, right? So, but in the 60s, it's still about men. Ellison, Wright, Baldwin would be the main ones. There are other really good writers, but they would be the ones who received the most notoriety, right? So, but Dumas, in a decade where the black writer seemed especially in vogue, was unable to establish a publishing foothold. There are not many documents to elucidate on his publication challenges, but there was at least one key incident in 1962 that may have had a profound effect on his journey toward the printed page. The celebrated novelist Ralph Ellison came to Rutgers in 1962 as their first visiting creative writer. And let's see if I can. This seems to be acting up. Well, we'll go to Plan B. There we go. So Ellison's the first visiting creative writer there at Rutgers. The author of the classic novel Invisible Man was the exemplar of literary success, and young black writers, especially men, were teeming for advice and direction from this literary lion. But Ellison would have none of it. He wasn't interested in mentoring. Or, as Toni Morrison puts it, Ralph had no interest in rallying for such writers. He wasn't committed to bringing the next generation of writers forth. If you can make it, fine, but I ain't helping you, more or less, right? So Henry had to learn this lesson firsthand. Early during Ellison's tenure on campus in 1962, Henry left the literary standard bearer a manuscript of short stories and perhaps a draft of his novel in progress. But Ellison never responded to him. Henry's contemporary, Alan Shoes, who was studying for his doctorate in comparative literature, recalled Ellison complaining about material Henry had left for him. If that poem-writing Negro shows up at my door, Ellison thundered, tell him I'm not here. I'll hide in the supply closet if I have to get away from him, right? And this is Ellison is quoted in more than one place saying this, or yes, he's quoted in more than one place as having said this. Ellison was not impressed with poetry or fiction that celebrated the masses, right? And he concluded that Henry's work did just that. It wasn't, in his mind, exclusive enough. It wasn't finely crafted enough, to Ellison's liking at least, right? Ironically, Henry would title his novel Visible Man in response to what in his mind was Ellison's flawed premise in Invisible Man, right? And those of you who are familiar with, well, you're familiar with the concept even if you haven't read Invisible Man or Henry's novel Visible Man, but it was retitled, and it's Genoa and the Greenstone. I can talk about why it got another title in the Q&A, but Henry challenged Ellison's assertion that black folks were invisible, right? Henry would say, just because you don't see me don't mean I'm not here. That was his point, right? And, you know, I like both of, I think both of them are really good writers. Clearly, Ellison has distinguished himself, but that was Henry's retort to him, and he may not have made as strong a retort as had Ellison given him or his work a chance. But here's the bigger concern for me. What might have unfolded if Ellison had considered Dumas's work? Dumas, with an encouraging word to potential publishers from Ellison, would likely have seen his work published during his lifetime. So there's a kind of gatekeeper function at work. He was surely in a literary briar patch, one of Ellison's timely metaphors in black folklore for exploring the psychology of black folk. In variations of that tale, Brer Rabbit and Brer Fox are adversaries, and black folk are represented in the undersized rabbit who has to find his way to outfox the fox. In this contemporary scenario, Dumas was the rabbit. If he was going to make it as a writer, he would have to go around Ellison. Indeed, he would manage to do so, but the route was more circuitous, and his arrival in the literary promised land would occur, of course, after his death. So, before we talk about how his books were published after his death, we should consider for a few moments the circumstances under which he was killed. Remember when I said if you looked him up, it would just say he had an altercation with a New York transit cop, white cop, rookie cop. That was included in the information, but that was all pretty much that you could find, right? So that police officer, the transit police officer, Peter Bienkowski, was never charged. No witnesses ever came forward, but it appears that Dumas had an altercation with someone on the subway platform, and the officer intervened as a result of that. Right? Well, we know how this story often goes when it comes to black men and white police officers. Initially, I thought it but another example of police misconduct at the expense of a black man. There was hardly any information in the public record about this shooting. And part of the reason there was no information is that when the New York City Transit Police merged with NYPD, Transit Police got rid of all their records. So they folded them into NYPD and just did away with all of their records, their information. So here's what complicates the story for me. Henry had arrived in New York to attend the wedding of a friend, right? But emotionally, he was torn up, and here's why. There were at least 3 sources of angst for him. By this point, Henry had begun experimenting with drugs. Remember when I mentioned at the beginning that his wife was concerned about certain negative aspects of his life, diminishing his literary legacy, this is one of those things. So he had begun experimenting with drugs. His marriage was unraveling. And Loretta had told him that having a family in form, but not in fact, was no longer an option. She'd be filing for divorce. With King's assassination, Henry and his partners out in East St. Louis were preparing for a race war. He purchased a gun for the first time. He even took it on the plane to New York. One of the last people to see him before that subway encounter was son Ra. He realized Henry's volatile condition, convincing his friend to leave the gun with him. Even without the gun, the Henry who encountered Officer Bienkowski was not the man most friends and family had known. The last year of his life had been hard, and he was the primary source of much of his pain. So when he and the officer confronted each other, someone's death was probably inevitable. In fact, when his wife received the news that there had been a shooting and that Henry was involved, and she and her kids, the kids are out in Illinois, she assumed Henry had shot someone. She assumed he had killed someone. So she was really devastated to find out the reverse had occurred. The publication of his work after his death presented another briar patch scenario around race and the politics of publishing. After he was killed in '68, his colleagues at Southern Illinois University set out to have his work published. I alluded to that just a few minutes ago, right? And it was an interracial effort. There was a white poet who edited his manuscripts. There was a black poet, Eugene Redmond, who pretty much decided what was going to go into the books, and the white poet's name was Hale Chatfield. And then there was another scholar, William Crosby, who secured the contract with the university press, right? Back in New Jersey, Loretta Dumas endorsed the effort, and things worked out. They published the books, things were fine, right? But something shifted in the mid-'70s when Morrison found Dumas, realized that he had published some books, and she wanted to get his books out to a larger audience through her trade press, Random House, right? So what she did, she published his books, but she made one significant change. In the university editions, on the cover, Hale Chatfield's name was there, the white poet that I referred to, who helped edit the manuscripts. On the Random House editions, his name was gone, right? And the only name on the Random House edition was Eugene B. Redmond, right? So Hale was hot. Well, yeah. I just thought about that. That's, yeah. But Chatfield was hot, right? And so his name had been removed, and Morrison and Redmond, his literary executor, their argument was that this was a calculated publishing decision, and that given the time period, it would have been very difficult to market a black book edited by a white man, right? That's basically what, they use more nuanced language, but that was their point, that if you want Dumas's books out there and you want them to sell, you can't put a white man's name on it. Not in the 70s, not in the age of Superfly, if you will, right? And so in a world where blackness was in vogue, putting a white editor out in front in the marketing of a black book would simply have turned off some black readers. Redmond and Morrison decided this was not the project to trumpet the virtues of interracial collaboration. There were already enough challenges associated with publishing Henry's books, not to mention the fact that he had been killed by a white transit cop. In today's parlance, the optics would have been terrible. So Morrison and Redmond put their best effort forward to publish his work, and their effort notwithstanding, he still did not become a household name. But their efforts are bearing fruit. His work is now appearing in anthologies of American and African American literature, most notably in the Norton Anthology of African American Literature in 2014. And I'm just about done. I'll share two other things with you. And to give you a sense of where Dumas is now, this is a link to a story that was published in October of 2015 on the NPR website about Henry Dumas. Now, it looks at his death in great detail, and the writer Benish Ahmed, who's a wonderful journalist who has done some interesting documentary work on the experiences of girls globally, right? She's written a really interesting piece on Dumas and the unfortunate series of incidents with the police and black men and black women that have occurred like over the past 4 or 5 years. So she talks about his literary significance, but more of the focus is on how he died, right? And so this is just one example of him being more part of the conversation in terms of acknowledging his literary achievements. So, in Henry Dumas's poetic and fictional worlds, characters sing about and see things that others do not understand. In a white world that often refuses to acknowledge what black people feel and think, his characters assume their world to be valid. His was a creative world, briar patches and all, that transcended time and place. In this sense, the mainstream literary world is finally catching up with this most visible man. Henry Dumas is Brer Rabbit after all, and in that world, the rabbit gets the last laugh. And I'll conclude with that. Thank you. Dr. Connolly.
We have some time for question and answers, and we have, is it 3 or 4 volunteers? Who have mics? So if they have questions, you guys have mics. You can do that as well. But if you have mics, raise your hand for the mics.
So thank you so much for your talk. I'm really interested in the invisible man, visible man contrast between Ellison and Dumas. And was part of your point that Dumas's novels implicitly criticizing Ellison for taking a white perspective? Or am I reading that in? So, right, so like to white people, black people, African American people look invisible, and Dumas is saying, wait, if you assume a white perspective, maybe, but I'm not going to assume that perspective. So is that part of the criticism and the tension between Dumas and Ellison?
And he would, in various circles he'd circulate in, he'd stand in front of people and say, feel me, I'm here, right? Yeah, I mean, it's just, his point, sort of beyond that concern, if you're familiar with the novel Invisible Man, the novel ends with the narrator in hibernation, underground in New York, right? Well, Henry's thought was that the narrator or the black folk need to come back home to the South. So Visible Man, or they decided not to call his novel or title it Visible Man because it would be too similar to Ellison, right? So they call it, Eugene Redmond and Toni Morrison, titled it Genoa and the Greenstone. And it's all about a naive young black man who leaves the South, fleeing understandable oppression and dangers, to return, right? Because when he's in the Midwest, when he's in the North, he's never at home, right? And so what Henry does is bring Ellison's narrator, if you will, home, right? And of course, that's what we're experiencing. That's what we've been experiencing in the South, the re-migration of black folks back to the South, right? Even folks who didn't live here originally, right? Right, for many reasons, but Henry very much believed that this place, this soil, is where African Americans' roots are, right? Wherever you go, this is your place. It's where you started. As you being black folks who identify as African American, it's different if you're African and you have that experience on the continent, right? That make a little bit of sense? Okay. Oh, Dr. Mixon.
What took him from New York City to East St. Louis, Illinois?
Oh, you would ask that.
Well, I used to live in St. Louis.
Well, it's a lot of, basically, he was involved with Lois Silber, or that's her maiden name, from 1963 to 1967. He, on New Year's Eve, New Year's Eve, 1966, he and Lois had an encounter. And this is her talking. I'm recounting what she has said, and I've put it in the book. He hit her. They had a violent encounter. He wanted to sort of return to the relationship. She was at a point where she was done with him, right? And so she threatened to call the police and, have some folks get on him, if you will. And so he had a connection out in the Midwest. Actually, before he went to the Experiment in Higher Education at Southern Illinois University, Edwardsville, he had gone to Hiram College in Ohio, right? And this may interest you all. You all have heard of Shelby Steele, the black conservative, real conservative. He's real smart, real conservative. He has a twin brother, Claude Steele, who's a renowned psychologist. And if Shelby is real conservative, Claude is real liberal, right? And so dinner at their house has to be a challenge. But some of the information I got about Henry was from Claude Steele, who had been an undergraduate at Hiram when Henry went there. And after he went there for a very short period of time, he went out to East St. Louis, and the person who helped him get to East St. Louis and Southern Illinois University was Shelby Steele. Right. Because back then, Shelby was a radical. I mean, he was. He was. He looked for confrontation, opportunities to confront the white police establishment and things of that nature. You would never know that now, but that's how he was back then.
In the circumstances surrounding his death, you didn't mention the mistaken identity, which is a different narrative. And I was wondering if you could say a little about that.
Yeah, and you're right, Dr. Ruiz. People did say it was a case of mistaken identity. I just couldn't find anything that supported that. I'm not saying that it didn't happen. I'm not saying that that wasn't the case. But I got more information about what Henry's state of mind was. And so that's what I focused more on. But you're right. Many accounts said it was a case of mistaken identity. But what's odd is no one ever came forward to say, hey, I was there. This is what happened. Nothing, right? But that's why I hadn't focused as much on that. And is there a real question up there? Does he have a real question, Jalen? Okay, well, let him ask it if he says it's real. That's my son.
When was Henry Dumas born?
He was born in 1934. All right? That was an excellent question. And Kristen, there's Dr. West right here, Kristen.
I remember, Jeffrey, when you were working on this book, and I would stop by your office, and you would talk about trying to gain the confidence of the people that you were interviewing, and it seemed like a long and winding road to try to, especially the woman with whom he had the affair, and to gain her confidence that she would cooperate with the project, which the project would be difficult to have accomplished without that. I wondered if you could talk a little bit about what charms you cast to make that happen, because it didn't happen instantly. I remember it took a while.
Right. No, you're right. It didn't happen instantly at all. With the odd thing is, well, I guess it's not really odd. They had their reservations. Lois Wright certainly had her reservations, and she really struggled with being the white chick back in the 1960s because see, they couldn't go to places they couldn't socialize in white circles, right? So they would go to black circles, right? And people were fine with her, but they always referred to her as the white chick, right? Well, you can imagine how that might make one feel, right? And so what I realized was that part of her distrust of me had to do with those experiences. And so I just had to, trust that she would see that I was interested in telling the story, right? Another challenge with Loretta Dumas, and I hadn't even thought about this, was that I had to really figure out when was a good time to call her. Right? Because depending on what we were going to talk about, I wouldn't want to, end a conversation at 9:30 talking about the more negative aspects of his life, especially the way in which he was shot and all of that. So things like that I had no idea about when I set out to do it. And the other thing, your memory and research has demonstrated this. Though our memories can be good, our memories can play tricks on us, or our minds can play tricks on us. So if I'm interviewing someone and asking them about an event that happened 30 years ago or 40 years ago, I can't, I take what they say, but I've still got to try to find some other evidence to corroborate what they're saying, because, I'm going to change a story that I tell that happened 30, 35 years ago. And if I'm smart, I'm going to make myself look better, right? Right? So, but it really was time and just letting them see that I just wanted to tell the story. And wherever that would take us, that's where it would take us. But what was clear about both of them, and Eugene Redmond and Jay Wright, but them less so, was that in the end, they both wanted the story told. Right? Now, they never talked to each other, right? But they definitely provided information as a kind of tandem that enabled me to tell the story. All right? I mean, without Lois, I don't have any letters. I have letters that he sent to Lois. I would have letters from him to Loretta, but in one of her rare fits of anger, right about the time she had decided to divorce him, she took his letters to the backyard, put them on a grill, and lit them up. You know, she basically burned him in effigy. Right? Right? And I mean, I understood that, but to this day, she regrets that, because that was one of the things that had attracted her to her, because he sent her a number of letters during his time in Saudi Arabia. Well, we'll come back down. You're good, Robin. And you all should know, Robin and Kristen are in the English department, excellent graduate students, and I don't know where Stacy is. Oh, Stacy's social work? Social work. Yeah, they've been standing up for me. I appreciate it.
Well, you just hit upon what I was going to ask you about the letters on the grill, because I didn't hear where the personal papers of Dumas are, and with two vested interest parties still alive, and I'm curious whether or not the personal papers as a personal archive is still a living archive, or if it's been closed. And then the addendum to that is, where are your research notes going, and are you adding to the Dumas collection?
Oh, my papers on Dumas?
Yes.
Oh, I will, but right now his widow, Loretta Dumas, is in conversation with a couple of universities, couple of libraries about his papers. And so I have what she has, but I would never give it to anyone without her permission. So I'm just waiting on her to make that decision. And she's thinking about a couple of schools up north, a couple of schools in the University of Arkansas, because he's from Arkansas. Emory, maybe. You know, I went there, so I may have some connections there, or be able to introduce her to some people. Lois, her papers won't go anywhere. I doubt that she would be interested in giving them or having them purchased. All right, and in fact, say it again. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah, there are drafts of many of his stories and poems. Mm-hmm. Mrs. Dumas has all of that. Yeah, she has multiple drafts of things, and so does Eugene B. Redmond, his literary executor. All right, and the only way I could view his papers with Lois Wright, I had to visit her and her husband in New England. And I sat at their kitchen table, and I took pictures of every letter. You know, I mean, that's somewhat tedious, but again, once I committed to it, I had to finish. Oh, I couldn't give you a number. They have been appraised. I know that, because the Schomburg has approached Loretta Dumas about them, but I don't know the figure. And I always let her know that was not. I think that's where they should go. No, I'm not saying I think they should go to the Schomburg. I'm saying I think they do need to be in a repository somewhere. But I never wanted her to think that was my aim or goal. So I'll help if they request my help, but I'm not pushing that angle, because they're still, you know, they're precious. Robin, after. Where'd the microphone sneak off to? Oh, Dr. Mack.
I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit about how he changed after the Emmett Till tragedy and whether or not that was reflected in his personality, his writings, and if you thought that that was really a precursor to his reaction after King's assassination.
Yeah, well, it was, well, I should probably preface it with, in Henry's family, it wasn't diagnosed, but the men struggled with depression. His father struggled with depression. His father was an alcoholic. And his two sons struggled with depression. And they were clinically diagnosed. And they both, not together, but both his sons, and now he's deceased at this point, right? He's killed in 1968. In 1988 and 1992, both his children commit suicide. That's unusual, right? So Loretta Dumas, all the men in her life are gone, have been gone, right? So to your question about Emmett Till, I think Henry probably was predisposed in some ways to be inclined toward depression. And what happened to Till it pushed him, and it continued to push on him. And remember, that's 55. So 55 to 65, for black folks in the South, it's tough, right? Even though changes are coming, it's coming too slowly, right? So I think he had a hard time just processing that. And I think in some ways he dealt with some guilt because he was up in New Jersey and New York. Not that that was a perfect place, but it wasn't Money, Mississippi, right? And he struggled with that. And then as he started to experiment with drugs, and then Dr. King, it's the culmination of events. I wouldn't say it was one thing, but he was, as Sun Ra would put it, he was just in a bad place, and I could feel it. I'm summarizing what Sun Ra, according to his biographer, said about him when he saw him shortly before he would leave his apartment and be killed on the subway platform.
Was there a reflection in his writing?
Oh yeah. In his short stories, there are a number of allusions to Till, or just to the specter of lynching, right? And in some of the stories, those who would lynch, something happens to them, right? So there's resistance, if you will, as well. But yeah, it's definitely in his fiction, definitely. And most of his fiction is focused on young men, a few women here and there, but men who would have been like him in the South.
Thank you, Professor Lick.
Yes.
Yeah. See, I have a question here, but before the question, I'll make a quick comment to complete a bit what you just said. See, scholars in general, I don't know, we don't know who takes from whom. Mm-hmm. You see, because if you read Michel Foucault and you read Edward Said on the concept of origin and beginning, you see, Said will say he didn't take anything from Foucault. And when you go back and read Jean-Baptiste, for instance, 19th or 18th century, you see that all of them, they move, see, in a kind of asymptotic way towards Jean-Baptiste, who is the origin, who is the first who produced the concept of origin and beginning.
Okay.
See? Now, my question is the following. Here, we don't know, I didn't follow very well that part when we are talking of a magical realism, as you mentioned. Between Toni Morrison, I read a lot of the work of Toni Morrison, and I thought to see her piece of literature. And she produced a lot of work on magical realism. Her work. Between her and the Dumas, who is the one then who took from, you see, the other scholars, as far as magical realism is concerned?
Well, Morrison has certainly, I mean, her body of work has a more consistent imprint, magical realism imprint, than Henry's does. But something like, as I mentioned, Ark of Bones is probably one of the first stories that engages in a more fluid sort of exploration of the self, right? And remember, before the 60s, and this is the case, well, at least with African American literature, it's really realism driven, right? I mean, that's Richard Wright, James Baldwin. Ellison, not so much realism. He's more experimental in some ways, but the idea of imagining or even asserting that there's more to life or experience than what one can see, right? I mean, that's why you have the figure Head Eye, because he's seeing what others are not able to see for whatever reason, right? And you have many characters in his fiction who are like that. So I would say that had he lived, we probably would have a body of materials like Morrison where you can trace, you can look at how she's experimenting here and there, but you just don't have the sweep, the scope with Dumas to do that, right? And it's unfortunate. And to the question about papers, he has a lot of papers, but they're all, or mostly, there's not a secret or manuscript hidden in there that could be published. There are copies of manuscripts of things that have been published, but not, you know, this novel that could be published 40 odd years after his death. Nothing like that. Nothing that I've seen. Let me put it that way. Robin, Provost, and right here. Well, no, I mean, he's there. Yeah, I was just letting you know. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Professor Leek. I just wanted to know how your book has been received, and has there been some sort of a spark in people wanting to know more about this gentleman?
Thank you for your question. Yes, there's been, I've gotten a little bit of pushback, right? Because some people didn't like the fact that I revealed some of the more negative aspects of Henry's life. But if I'm going to tell the story, I have to tell the story. And I think his life and his humanity can stand up to criticism, right? So, but most of the feedback has been positive. I've gotten requests for interviews by students who are doing work on the 1960s, the Black Arts Movement, and so they now have a resource, I guess, to sort of fill in some gaps, right? So the response has been positive. I've gotten positive reviews. I got hit pretty hard in one, and basically the person said I didn't write the book that they would have written. So, so in some ways I just said thank you, because I can't do anything with that. But yes, often reviewers do that. They say if I had written, right. Dr. Lorden?
You mentioned his experience in Saudi Arabia and his opportunity to learn about Islam. When he came back to the States, was he connected to or influenced by the Black Muslim movement?
Well, that's a good question. He applies for membership to the Nation of Islam and is accepted, right? But he does it to see if he can do it, right? And I'm not saying that he was skeptical about the Nation of Islam, but he appreciated the Muslim, what he called the Muslim approach, right? And he wrote to Loretta about these things. Now, this is what she told me, right? And then there was one piece that she didn't, I guess, burn because it wasn't really a letter. It's like a diary entry where he talks about the culture in Saudi Arabia and sort of the sanctity of life, the beauty of the Islamic faith. And you can, if I just had that, I would have thought, okay, he's leaning. He might go there. But he never did. In fact, what happened once he returned to the U.S. after Saudi Arabia, and I didn't share any of this in my presentation, for a period, he becomes a fire and brimstone preacher. If you don't know the gospel, you go in there to that hell is hot, remember, right? For about a year, no one knew what to do with him because, and Loretta was like, I don't know where this has come from. And she's a proper Presbyterian. So she was totally flummoxed, right? But that eased up when he got to Rutgers and he hit the literary scene, right? His first meeting with some literary folks at Rutgers, he tried to convert them. He did. And I mean, this has been documented, right? The second year, he joined them. He said he was no longer a preacher or a minister or aspiring to be, he was now a philosopher, right? So he was in search. He was in search, I believe. One more question?
Hello. Thank you. First of all, I wanted to make comment about the impact of African American people going back to the South. I being one of the African American people coming from California to the South, and it's been less than a year, and it's different, but yet welcoming, and it feels like home. And so I wanted to say that's been a really nice blessing for me. But
good.
Yeah, but how would you say your experience in learning about him, writing about him, parallels to what young men are experiencing today?
Well, there are parallels.
Not change, parallel.
Yeah, there are parallels, at least on the surface, right? Even if we didn't know that emotionally he was unstable when he had gone to New York, that his wife had told him she was going to divorce him, that he was experimenting with drugs. We all know of instances, and I write about some other instances in New York at the time where black men had been killed, right? So that's unfortunately part of the narrative that we have in this country. And as Langston Hughes says, we got to look at the beautiful and the ugly. There are parallels but I'd say the deeper or the bigger parallel for me is that even for young men who make mistakes, right, or who may present themselves in a way where they're, trying to have a lot of bravado and machismo, oftentimes they're searching, right? And the easiest way to protect themselves emotionally is to position themselves in a way where no one will breach, right? Because then if you breach my space, then you see that I'm actually somewhat inadequate. I'm actually scared sometimes or fearful. And so I think that's what he was attuned to as a writer, as an artist, right? That often your baddest man or person is often presenting themselves in that way because they're really afraid, right? And how many? There's some sports folks here from athletics who I work with in my capacity as faculty athletics rep. So I love sports, right? And as in my introduction, as Dr. Connolly said, I really thought I was going to the NBA. That's what she said, and that's true, right? I was preparing at Waddell Park, right? But we often don't, if young people are not oriented toward what everybody else is oriented to, we often don't provide them a means to explore those other things, right? And so are we as encouraging when someone wants to be an artist, right? Or to just do something that's not what everybody else is doing, right? Basketball is fine. Lacrosse might work for him or her. But who's going to play lacrosse, right? By the way, Hampton University just had their first lacrosse match, D1, right? Did someone with him? Oh, okay. All right. Big building, big building. Yeah, go ahead. Yes.
More questions? Feel free to, if I may say, just go and keep asking questions. Our next person speaking is March Flynn. Thank you very much for being here, and thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you. Wonderful evening.